Hello, everyone. So we're here for our next series of videos. That's going to be over 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and it's so long. I just thought it was funny to put this all in one place. So some long chapter titles, and we're going to start with the Trans-Saharan Trade. Okay, so it's our second land-based trade route we talk about. We have the Silk Road, and then Indian Ocean trade, and now this final trade route. And again, this is all connecting back to 1.5 and also 1.2. So, because it's the connection between Africa and Dar al Islam, as well as some of South Asia too, because of the Indian Ocean trade route that connects us to East Africa. Okay. So here is our vocab, and then I think there's 2 pages. Oh, there's only one page. So yeah. So going into the Trans-Saharan trade, the most important thing to think about with Trans-Saharan trade is that the Sahara Desert itself is a environmental boundary that prevented the connection of sub-Saharan or sub meaning below sub-Saharan communities in Africa from connecting with superior Saharan or northward states because of the Sahara Desert. Which means that until that environmental barrier was overcome, the connection of sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa was going to be limited. And eventually, the trade route is kind of conquered by 2 kind of feats of human effort. So first is a extensive work by merchants to map and track oases, which are groundwater sources in the Sahara Desert, so that you could plan your voyage accordingly. Technologies we talked about with Indian Ocean trade, like the magnetic compass, are also things that can maybe eventually be helpful in making this route and tracking more effective. But these trade routes are developed in before the compass arrives to Africa and Southwest Asia. So the other it's a mapping process that's done by merchants. But the thing that really enables success is going to be the domestication of the camel, as well as its use. So, for example, camels are indigenous to the Arabian Desert. These are animals that evolved through natural selection to be very resistant in a desert climate. But then, after humans noticed their capacity to live as wild animals in the desert with little food or with little water, just as much food, they became really important. They saw their use. And so humans take the camel and they kind of breed it into docility and breed it to their purposes. The camels that are indigenous to the Arabian Desert are the dromedary camel or the one-hump camel. And it truly, and I mean this, guys, truly is circumstantial that Muslims come on camels, right? That the Islam did not have to take hold the way that it did. It happened to do so. Camels also presented a way for traders who were Muslim to overcome that environmental barrier. And it is through the domestication of the camel that Islam comes to West Africa eventually. I think you probably have inferred that camels just don't need much water, and that's what gives them such a benefit. Now, camels, I've talked about in my class extensively. If you've never seen a camel, maybe you haven't. I forget about them all the time, even though I'm a WAP teacher and camels seem really important. Camels are huge, especially compared to horses. That the prospect of riding a camel is pretty audacious, and it's not super simple. So the way you got to develop a kind of technology that makes sure you can comfortably sit and stably sit on a camel. Sometimes that means having something set up on the hump. Sometimes that's sitting in front of the hump. So if the camel kind of does this, you're sitting here, right, instead of up here. And then the AMSCO makes specific notes that the camel saddle that becomes most important is the Somali saddle, that can carry a great deal of weight and material. I have to recommend the table on page 104 is really, really good that talks about all the different technologies, right? I talk in my class that the septic theme of technology is essentially what is a problem and then how do humans solve it. The camel saddle is a excellent example of technology overcoming an environmental problem, okay? But if you aren't reading the chapter and you're just trying to watch the video today, I would recommend at least going to page 104 and looking at all the permutations of the camel saddle. As you probably remember from 1.5, that gold was the most important export, but they also had access to ivory through the presence of elephants, and then slaves, which, slaves are kind of anywhere in the post-classical world, but they had them. They imported salt. Salt is really important to help camels survive, so that's what kind of drives demand as well. Textiles, the kind of fabric materials that could be grown in Africa were less productive, and so those textiles become really important because they can be cultivated elsewhere. Horses were not indigenous. Horses are indigenous to like Central Asia, so horses are of value too. And Islam obviously comes along the trade route as well. So next we have to do is one of the most important consequences of understanding what this trade does to Africa is that states use trade as a warrant for expansion and to enable their own expansion. So Mali is the best example that they give for this. Mali taxed the trade that came in and out of their kingdom, which means that as trade grew, they use that taxation to centralize the state and make the state stronger. But remember that though trade seems to be the only thing we talk about with Africa, most Africans were farmers. As in, for most of the human story, people have been farmers and cultivators of food for the consumption of for their families as well as for consumption in a market. Like Kashgar or Samarkand, which will show up a few more times in this unit, Timbuktu and Gao are cities that become centers of trade, which then, because so many Muslims are coming up, become centers of Islamic learning. So something that becomes a necessity as a consequence of trade expanding is the centralization and standardization of currency. That, yes, a barter system could exist and might be beneficial, but currency is something that it makes us exchange more efficient, right? Because if you don't have currency where everyone agrees has a kind of value and you're a chicken seller and you try to sell your chickens but no one wants your chickens, you're kind of screwed. But if a chicken is worth 5 pennies and you can sell that chicken for 5 pennies, you can then use those 5 pennies to buy something from a person who would not accept your chicken as adequate. Or the chickens have an unstable value, right? A chicken might be really valuable to one person, but very limited to another, which means that you're limited by the individual demand. But if everyone needs money, everyone's always going to accept the value of money. Now, because the trade routes became so important, states and rulers began to invest in its protection, and through that, militaries grew, and the function of military was to keep this trade route expanding and protected. Because if the trade route was not protected, you would disincentivize people to go to your area because they would be taking on more risk because bandits might target their trade and things like that. So demand for trade and the goods available, right? So say Mali's neighbor had lots of gold, something that was of value to Mali, that would be used to justify Mali's conquest of that region. Sorry, my laptop's about to die. And then Sundiata, who is one of the leaders of Mali, is a great example of this. And then a person you learned about last unit, which I have a little typo, would be Mansa Musa. He goes along the Trans-Saharan Trade route, but not as a merchant, but as a monarch on his Hajj to Mecca. One moment. And, the Mansa Musa's Hajj has this, definitely has this opulenceness to it. But what really comes out of this is that you can just know that from Mansa Musa's Hajj, how wealthy African states have become. that they had this, they could have this luxury, they could luxuriate in the wealth of Mansa Musa and Mali through this trade. When Mansa Musa returns, he invests a lot of the state's wealth into further developing the Islamic centers in Timbuktu. And then you're going to learn about the next unit in Africa, a state that is central to Trans-Saharan trade from 1450 to the late 17th century is Songhai, which again are going to be continuous. That Ghana, Mali, and Songhai all kind of are this very similar states in terms of how they function. They just become increasingly more complex. Yeah. And so that is our first video, and I'm going to write the summary before I do the next one. Thank you, guys.